I used to think a demand to get out during Thanksgiving dinner was just impulsive anger. But when his mother called me a failure between bites of stuffing, I saw the truth. Ethan did not defend me. He gave me an ultimatum to stop arguing or leave. I did not scream. I simply nodded. Sometimes the most brutal revenge is accepting their words as absolute truth and forcing them to live with the empty chair. My name is Autumn Salas, and exactly 42 minutes into Thanksgiving dinner, Lorraine Caldwell looked me dead in the eye and called me a failure wrapped in delusion. It was not a scream. It was not a drunken outburst that one could dismiss the next morning with an awkward apology and a bottle of Advil. It was spoken with the terrifying, sterile calm of a judge reading a death sentence. The sentence hung in the air above the roasted turkey and the crystal wine glasses, sucking the oxygen right out of the room. I remember the sound that followed immediately after. It was the sharp, singular clink of a silver fork hitting a porcelain plate. Someone had dropped it. I think it was Sophia, Ethan's sister-in-law. But I could not take my eyes off Lorraine to check. The silence that descended on that dining room in Briar Glen was absolute. It was heavy, physical, and suffocating. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound I had not noticed all evening, suddenly roared in my ears like a jet engine. I sat there, my hand half raised to reach for the cranberry sauce, frozen in a tableau of domestic horror. My brain was trying to process the syntax of her sentence. A failure, wrapped in delusion. The words were so precise, so cruel, that they felt rehearsed. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, prickly sensation starting at my scalp and washing down to my fingertips. I turned my head slowly to look at Ethan. We had been together for 2.5 years. In my mind, he was my partner, my teammate. The person who was supposed to have my back when the world got sharp edges. I expected him to laugh. I expected him to say, "Mom, that is enough," or "You have had too much Chardonnay." I expected him to squeeze my hand under the table, that secret signal we used to share that meant, "We are in this together." But Ethan did not look at me. He was staring intently at his plate, pushing a pile of mashed potatoes around with his knife as if he were trying to reconstruct a topographical map. His jaw was set tight. He was not shocked. He was annoyed, and the annoyance was not directed at his mother for insulting the woman he planned to marry. It was directed at the situation. It was directed at me for being the target. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was steady, which surprised me. I sounded calm, but inside, my stomach had turned into a knot of cold lead. That was when Ethan finally looked up. There was no warmth in his brown eyes. There was no apology. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a man who realized his dinner was being ruined. "Autumn, stop," he said. His voice was low, a warning shot fired across the centerpiece. I blinked. "Stop? She just called me a—" I said stop. Ethan cut me off, his voice rising just enough to assert dominance, but not enough to be considered shouting. He gestured vaguely with his fork. A dismissal. "Do not argue with my mother. You know how she is. Just drop it. Do not make a scene." I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time in 2 years, I saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of losing me, but fear of displeasing her. I saw the weakness masked as pragmatism. And then, he delivered the sentence that shattered whatever illusion of love I had left. "Don't argue with my mother," Ethan said, enunciating every word. "Or you get out." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Across the table, Grant, Ethan's brother, looked down at his lap, visibly uncomfortable but silent. Sophia looked like she wanted to speak, her mouth slightly open, but Grant's hand was resting firmly on her forearm, anchoring her to silence. They were all complicit. This was the family dynamic. Lorraine fired the bullets, and everyone else laid down on the floor to avoid getting hit. Ethan was not just lying down, he was actively pulling me into the line of fire to save himself. "Get out." The command echoed in my head. He was evicting me. Not just from the house, but from the circle of protection a partner is supposed to provide. He was stripping me of my status as his equal and reducing me to a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not the heartbreak I would have expected. It was not the hot, tearing grief of a breakup. It was something colder. It was the feeling of glass shattering on a stone floor, sharp, irreversible, and dangerous. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my wine in his face, though the urge to watch the red liquid stain his pristine white collar was almost overwhelming. I realized in that split second that any display of emotion would only validate Lorraine's assessment of me. If I cried, I was unstable. If I yelled, I was aggressive. If I begged, I was pathetic. So, I did nothing. I picked up my linen napkin from my lap. I folded it. I folded it once, then twice, aligning the corners with agonizing precision. I placed it on the table next to my untouched plate. I looked at Lorraine. She was watching me over the rim of her wineglass, her eyes glittering with triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she had put the little failure in her place. Then I turned my gaze to Ethan. He was still glaring at me, waiting for me to submit, to apologize, to shrink back into the chair and eat my turkey in shameful silence. "Is that your final decision?" I asked. My voice was soft. It was conversational. It was the tone one uses to ask if the mail has arrived. Ethan rolled his eyes, a gesture of supreme teenage petulance on a 34-year-old man. "God, Autumn, go cool off. Seriously, get out if you can't be civil. I am not dealing with this tonight." "Okay," I said. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that made Grant flinch. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my dress. I did not look at Lorraine again. She did not deserve my attention. I looked only at Ethan. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. I turned and walked out of the dining room. My heels clicked on the floorboards. A rhythmic countdown. I walked down the hallway to the foyer. I took my coat from the rack. I put it on, buttoning it all the way to the top. I picked up my purse. I could feel the silence from the dining room radiating down the hall. They were waiting. They were waiting for the slam of the door. The sign of the tantrums they expected from someone of my status. I opened the front door. The cold November air of Briar Glen hit my face, sharp and cleansing. I stepped out onto the porch. I closed the door behind me. I did not slam it. I closed it with a soft, definitive click. As I walked to my car, parked alone in the driveway, I realized my hands were not shaking. I felt light. I felt untethered. Ethan thought he had sent a misbehaving child to a timeout. He thought I would drive around the block, cry in a parking lot, and come back begging for forgiveness. He thought the threat of "get out" was a leash he could yank whenever I strayed too far from his mother's approval. He was wrong. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, reliable, paid off, mine, and turned the key. The engine purred to life as I backed out of the driveway, leaving the warm glow of the house behind. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had told me to get out. I was going to follow his instructions to the letter, but he had no idea that by the time I was finished following his orders, there would be no home, no relationship, and no reputation left for him to return to. They wanted to treat me like a disposable project. Fine. I would show them exactly what happens when you demolish the wrong structural wall. The collapse had started the moment I closed that door, and none of them even knew they were already standing in the rubble. The drive from Briar Glen back to my apartment in Lake Arbor takes exactly 45 minutes on a clear night. The highway was empty, just a long stretch of asphalt illuminated by the rhythmic passing of streetlights. It gave me time to think, not with the panic of a woman dumped, but with the cold calculation of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. Lorraine had called me a failure. She had looked at my life and decided it was wanting. But as the miles ticked by, I mentally pulled up my own file, the real dossier of Autumn Salas, to review the facts. I am 34 years old. I am a Latina woman who has never asked a single person for a handout since the day I turned 18. I live in Lake Arbor, Colorado, a city that demands a certain level of grit just to keep up with the cost of living. I do not just keep up, I thrive. My title is Strategic Operations Manager at Cinderline Systems. It is not a job that sounds flashy at a cocktail party, and it certainly does not come with a doctorate title that one can bludgeon people with at dinner tables. However, it is a role that requires managing complex logistics, overseeing a team of 20 people, and ensuring that multi-million-dollar supply chains do not collapse under pressure. I am good at it. In fact, I am excellent at it. My financial health is not a matter of speculation. It is a spreadsheet I update every Friday. I earn $112,000 a year. It is not private jet money, but it is enough to max out my 401k every single year. It is enough to maintain an emergency fund that could sustain me for 6 months if I lost my job tomorrow. I drive a 2014 Honda Accord. It has 120,000 miles on it, a small dent on the rear bumper from a parking lot incident 3 years ago, and perfectly maintained brakes. It is paid off. It gets me from point A to point B without fail. To a woman like Lorraine, an old car is a sign of poverty. To me, it is a badge of financial literacy. I do not pay interest to banks for the privilege of looking rich. Then there is my home. I rent a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, leafy complex on the north side of Lake Arbord. This detail is crucial. The lease is in my name, just my name. When I moved in 3 years ago, I qualified for it alone based on my income and my credit score, which sits comfortably at 805. Every piece of furniture in that apartment tells a story of my independence. The oversized gray sectional sofa in the living room was the first big purchase I made after my promotion at Cinderline. The heavy oak dining table where Ethan and I ate our weeknight meals was a restoration project I did myself over a summer. The art on the walls, mostly prints from local Colorado artists, was bought with money I saved specifically for decor. When I look around my living space, I see myself. And then, there was Ethan. Ethan Caldwell entered this carefully curated life 2.5 years ago. He was 34, just like me. He was handsome in that non-threatening, catalog model way, dark hair, easy smile, hands that always looked manicured. He worked in marketing, a field that suited his natural charm. When we met, I thought I had found the missing variable in my equation. He was ambitious but seemed grounded. He opened doors for me. He remembered how I took my coffee. He listened when I talked about work stress and offered advice that actually made sense. We moved in together 6 months ago. It seemed like the logical next step. He gave up his overpriced bachelor pad downtown and moved into my place in Lake Arbord. He brought his clothes, his high-end gaming computer, and a few boxes of books. He did not sign the lease. We agreed he would just Venmo me his half of the rent and utilities on the first of the month. At the time, it felt casual and easy. Now, staring at the white lines on the highway, I realized it was the single greatest strategic advantage I possessed. Our relationship had been good. We were the couple friends envied. We went hiking in the Rockies on weekends. We hosted game nights. We talked about a future that included a house with a yard and maybe a dog. There was no screaming, no cheating, no massive incompatibilities. Except for her. Lorraine Caldwell was the ghost that haunted the edges of our relationship long before she materialized in the flesh. For the first year, I only knew her through Ethan's descriptions. He painted a picture of a woman who was formidable, academic, and fiercely protective. "My mother is a force of nature," he would say with a laugh that sounded a little too nervous. "She has her doctorate in comparative literature, and she thinks the world should run on proper grammar and high standards." He told me stories about his childhood that were meant to be funny but sounded terrifying to me. Stories about her rewriting his elementary school essays because they lacked intellectual rigor. Stories about her vetting his high school prom dates based on their parents' professions. Ethan framed this as tough love. He claimed she just wanted the best for her sons. "She is just particular," he had told me when we first discussed meeting her. "She has high expectations, but once she sees how smart and capable you are, she will love you." I should have seen the red flag then. It was waving frantically in my face. A 34-year-old man should not be worried about whether his mommy thinks his partner is capable enough. He should be worried about whether his partner likes his mother, but I was in love. I was wearing the rose-colored glasses that filter out the ultraviolet rays of toxic family dynamics. I told myself that I was strong enough to handle a difficult mother-in-law. I dealt with difficult stakeholders at Cinderline Systems every day. How bad could one retired academic be? I underestimated the difference between a difficult stakeholder and a woman who views her son as an extension of her own ego. Ethan's behavior around her should have been the second warning. When her name appeared on his phone, his posture changed. He stood up straighter, his voice pitched up half an octave. He became apologetic before she even accused him of anything. He was not a grown man talking to a parent. He was a subordinate reporting to a capricious CEO. I pulled my car into the parking lot of my apartment complex. The engine ticked as it cooled down in the chilly night air. I looked up at the window of my apartment. It was dark. Ethan was still back in Briar Glen, presumably trying to salvage the wreckage of the dinner, or perhaps listening to Lorraine explain why my departure was proof of my instability. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I was Autumn Salas. I was solvent, employed, and housed. I was not a project. I was not a fixer-upper. And I certainly was not a failure. Lorraine had looked at my Honda and my job title and assumed I was desperate for entry into her world. She thought I needed her approval to validate my existence. She was about to learn that I did not need her approval. I did not even need her son. What I needed was to excise the rot before it spread any further into the life I had built with my own 2 hands. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. The air was crisp, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe. I was home, and it was my home, not theirs. 2 days before Thanksgiving, the red flags started arriving, but they did not look like warnings. They looked like helpful advice wrapped in the guise of partnership. We were in our kitchen, packing the car with the contribution we had promised for the dinner, a homemade cranberry sauce I had spent 3 hours perfecting, and a pumpkin pie from the best bakery in Lake Arbor. Ethan stopped midway through zipping up his duffel bag and looked at me with a seriousness that made my stomach tighten. He sat me down on the edge of the sofa and took my hands. It felt like a pre-game huddle, the kind a coach gives a team before sending them out against a clearly superior opponent. He told me that his mother had high standards. He used those exact words. He said she was protective of the family legacy and that she often tested new people to see if they had the fortitude to belong. He tried to frame it as a quirky personality trait, something eccentric but ultimately harmless, like an aunt who collects porcelain dolls. But then he gave me the instructions. He told me that no matter what she said, I should just smile. He told me not to debate her. He said that if she made a comment about my hair, or my clothes, or my background, I should pretend I did not hear the malice in it. He said that if I just let her talk, she would eventually get bored and move on to someone else. He called it the path of least resistance. He squeezed my hands and told me that he just wanted us to get through the day smoothly so we could focus on our future. I nodded at the time, but deep down, a cold realization was taking root. I was looking at a 34-year-old man, a successful marketing professional, who had developed a complex, premeditated survival strategy to deal with his own mother. He was not talking about respectful deference to an elder. He was talking about conflict avoidance tactics one might use when dealing with a volatile hostage taker. It was not normal. I handled difficult negotiations for a living at Cinderline Systems. When a supplier tries to bully us on pricing, we do not smile and hope they get bored. We draw boundaries. Ethan had no boundaries. He had only evasive maneuvers. The dinner was being held at the home of Ethan's older brother, Grant, and his wife, Sophia. They lived in Briar Glen, a suburb about 20 minutes away from my apartment. Briar Glen is the kind of place where the homeowners association sends you a fine if your grass is half an inch too tall. It is beautiful, manicured, and completely sterile. As we drove through the winding streets lined with identical colonial-style houses, I felt a strange sense of foreboding. It wasn't the imposter syndrome Lorraine clearly hoped I would feel. It was the sensation of walking into a trap that everyone else already knew was set. I had prepared for this meeting with military precision. I knew that in families like Ethan's, showing up empty-handed was a capital offense, I had purchased a bottle of limited edition Cabernet Sauvignon that cost $85. I had also brought a hostess gift for Sophia, a set of hand-woven linen napkins from a boutique downtown. I had dressed in a navy midi dress that was conservative but tailored, paired with sensible heels. I had rehearsed answers to potential questions about my career, my family, and my 5-year plan. I approached this dinner the same way I approached a quarterly review with the board of directors. I believed that competence and politeness were a shield that could deflect any criticism. I told myself that a single dinner could not destroy a relationship that had survived 2.5 years of real life. A wedding was on the horizon, implicitly, if not officially, and I refused to let one difficult woman derail that trajectory. But as we pulled into Grant's driveway, seeing the other luxury SUVs parked in a neat row, my anxiety shifted. I realized I was not afraid of Lorraine disliking me. People dislike me sometimes. That is life. I was afraid of how Ethan would react when she inevitably started her testing. I looked at him as he turned off the engine. He took a deep breath, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, and fixed his hair. It was a nervous tic. He was steeling himself. He was putting on his armor, and in that moment, I realized his armor did not have room for me. He was preparing to survive the night, not to present us as a united front. We walked up the path to the front door, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. It should have felt supportive, but instead, it felt like he was steering me into the arena. When Sophia opened the door, her smile was tight. She hugged Ethan, and then she hugged me. But her eyes darted over my shoulder to the driveway, as if checking to see if Lorraine had arrived yet. Sophia was a small, nervous woman who seemed to vibrate with anxiety. Grant appeared behind her, holding a Scotch glass, looking already exhausted despite it being only 4 in the afternoon. The house was immaculate. It smelled of sage and roasting meat. It looked like a page out of a catalog, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Grant took our coats and made a joke about the traffic that fell flat. Sophia thanked me for the wine and the napkins with a relief that seemed disproportionate to the gift. It was as if my bringing a gift proved I was safe for the moment. We moved into the living room, and for the first hour, things were manageable. We talked about the weather. We talked about Grant's job in finance. We avoided any topic that had sharp edges, but every time a car drove past the house, all 3 of them, Ethan, Grant, and Sophia, flinched slightly. They were terrified. They were grown adults with mortgages and careers, yet they were terrified of their mother's arrival. I sat there, sipping my sparkling water, and felt a profound sense of isolation. I was an observer in a play where everyone else knew the lines and I had not been given a script. I watched Ethan laugh too hard at Grant's mediocre jokes. I watched him constantly check his watch. I watched him shrink. That was the moment the thought first crossed my mind. It was a fleeting, traitorous thought that I pushed away almost immediately, but it was there. I wondered what I would do if this went wrong, truly wrong. Not just awkward dinner wrong, but catastrophic failure wrong. I had never needed a backup plan with Ethan before. We were solid. We were a team. But looking at him now, seeing the sweat bead on his upper lip as the clock ticked closer to his mother's arrival, I mentally calculated the balance in my emergency savings account. I reminded myself where I had put the copy of my apartment lease. I reassured myself that the car in the driveway was mine. The keys were in my purse, and I could leave whenever I wanted. It was the first time I had ever consciously acknowledged that I might need an escape route from the man I loved. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was just reacting to the ambient anxiety in the room. I did not know then that this was not paranoia. It was intuition. My subconscious was already packing my bags, even while I sat there smiling and complimenting Sophia on her centerpieces. I was preparing for a war I did not start, armed with nothing but my dignity and the secret knowledge that unlike everyone else in that room, I was not afraid to walk away. The atmosphere in Grant and Sophia's living room shifted the second the doorbell rang. It was 5 o'clock on the dot. Until that moment, the air had been filled with the low murmur of polite conversation and the scent of sage butter. But the chime of the door acted like a starter pistol. Grant straightened his spine so abruptly I heard a vertebrae pop. Sophia smoothed the front of her dress with a frantic, repetitive motion, as if she were trying to wipe away an invisible stain. Ethan, standing next to me, stopped breathing for a full second. When the door opened, Lorraine Caldwell did not step inside so much as she permitted the house to encompass her. She was smaller than I expected, but she carried herself with the density of a neutron star, pulling all the gravity in the room toward her. She was wearing a charcoal wool coat that looked soft enough to melt in your hands, tailored so precisely it could have been painted onto her frame. Her hair was a steel gray bob, cut at a sharp angle that framed a face which had clearly been maintained with expensive creams and perhaps a very subtle surgeon's touch. She did not look like a grandmother or a matriarch. She looked like a board member arriving to liquidate a failing subsidiary. Grant stepped forward to hug her, but she held up a gloved hand, stopping him mid-stride. "Let me take my coat off first." "Grant," she said. Her voice was melodious but cool, like a flute played in an empty cathedral. "I do not want the smell of the drive clinging to me." She handed him the coat without looking at him, treating her eldest son like a well-trained coat check attendant. Then she turned her gaze to the rest of us. "Mother," Ethan said, stepping forward with that forced smile I was beginning to despise. "You look great. Dr. Caldwell," she corrected him effortlessly, as if he were a forgetful student. "We are in mixed company. Ethan, let us maintain standards." The distinction was drawn instantly, by insisting on her title before she had even reached the living room rug. She had elevated herself above everyone else in the room. We were civilians. She was the expert. She walked past Ethan and approached Sophia, who looked like she might vibrate out of existence. Lorraine scanned the room. Her eyes lingered on the centerpiece, then the curtains, and finally settled on Sophia. "The house is acceptable. Sophia, the walkway was swept. That is an improvement from last year." It was a compliment, technically, but it was delivered with the energy of a performance review. It established a baseline. Grant and Sophia had met the minimum requirements for her presence. They were safe, for now. Then, she turned to me. "I have sat across from auditors who were looking for embezzlement. I have negotiated with vendors who wanted to bankrupt my department. I have never felt as scrutinized as I did in that silence." Lorraine did not look at my face. She stared at my shoes. She worked her way up to the hem of my navy dress, paused at my waist, noted the lack of jewelry on my hands, and finally met my eyes. It was an appraisal. She was not looking at her son's girlfriend. She was inspecting a potential asset for the family portfolio, and her expression suggested she had found a scratch in the finish. "And this must be the friend," she said. "This is Autumn," Ethan said. He put a hand on my arm, but his grip was clammy. "My girlfriend. I told you about her." "Autumn," she repeated, testing the word as if it might be sour. "A seasonal name. How quaint." "It is nice to meet you. Dr. Caldwell," I said, extending my hand. I kept my grip firm, my chin up. I refused to be cowed by a woman in a cashmere sweater. She took my hand for exactly 2 seconds. Her skin was dry and cool. Indeed, she released me and walked toward the dining room without another word, assuming we would all follow in her wake. And we did. We filed in like ducklings, taking our assigned seats. Lorraine took the head of the table. Naturally, Grant sat to her right, Sophia to her left. Ethan and I were placed at the far end, the designated children's section of the hierarchy. As the wine was poured, Grant handling the bottle with trembling hands, Lorraine began to conduct the conversation. She asked Grant about his portfolio yields. She asked Sophia about the local school board, correcting Sophia's grammar twice in the span of 3 minutes. Then, she decided it was time to address the stranger at her table. She set her wineglass down. The crystal made a sharp sound against the wood. "Ethan tells me you work in industry," she said. She made the word industry sound like sewage management. "I work at Cinderline Systems," I said clearly. "I am the Strategic Operations Manager." I was proud of my title. I had worked 80-hour weeks to earn it. I managed a budget that would make Grant's eyes water. I solved problems that kept global supply chains moving. Lorraine tilted her head, looking at me with a faux puzzled expression. Operations, she mused. That involves boxes, logistics. It sounds small. The room went silent. It was a masterclass in diminution. She had taken a complex, high-level corporate role and reduced it to moving cardboard boxes in a warehouse. She had stripped away the strategy, the management, and the intellect, leaving only a caricature of manual labor. I waited for Ethan to speak. I waited for him to say, "Actually, Mom." She manages a team of 20 and reports directly to the VP. I waited for him to say, "She is brilliant at what she does." Instead, Ethan laughed. It was a nervous, breathy chuckle. "Well, it is not exactly brain surgery, Mom, but it keeps her busy." The betrayal hit me harder than the insult. Lorraine's comment was expected. She was a snob. But Ethan's laugh was a knife in the back. He was agreeing with her. He was signaling to his mother that he, too, found my career quaint and insignificant. He was throwing my professional identity onto the fire just to keep her warm. I looked at him, but he was busy cutting his turkey, refusing to meet my gaze. He was terrified of contradicting her. He would rather diminish me than correct her. "I manage strategy for the entire Western region," I said. My voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "It is actually quite a large operation. We handle infrastructure for 3 states. Lorraine waved a hand dismissively. "I'm sure it feels large to you, dear. Perspective is everything." She turned back to Grant. "Now tell me, have you considered that country club membership I mentioned? The one with the legacy admissions?" I picked up my wine glass. The red liquid swirled against the sides. I realized then that this was not a Thanksgiving dinner. This was an interview. It was a tribunal where the judge had already written the verdict before the defendant had even entered the room, and my defense attorney, the man sitting next to me, had just joined the prosecution. The warning bells in my head were no longer ringing. They were screaming. This was not just a difficult mother. This was a system designed to crush anything that did not fit their specific mold of prestige. And Ethan, my partner of 2 years, was not a victim of this system. He was a willing participant. I took a sip of wine. It tasted bitter, or perhaps that was just the taste of the realizations settling on my tongue. I was alone at this table. The second course was roasted Brussels sprouts with bacon, but I barely tasted them. The interrogation had shifted gears from dismissive commentary to a forensic audit. Lorraine had decided that vague insults were insufficient. She needed hard data to prove my inadequacy. "Cinderline systems," she said, cutting a sprout into quarters with surgical precision. "I have to admit, I have never heard of it. Is it a local startup? One of those places with beanbag chairs and no profit margin?" "It is a Fortune 500 company, Dr. Caldwell," I replied, keeping my voice level. "We have been in business for 40 years. We provide logistics software for the aerospace industry." "Aerospace," she repeated, dragging the word out. "It sounds very support staff. You are in the back office. I assume I am in strategy." I corrected her again. "I manage the operational budget for the Western Division." "And what does that pay these days?" The question landed on the table with a thud. Etiquette dictates that one does not ask about salary, certainly not over a holiday meal, and absolutely not within the first hour of meeting someone. But Lorraine did not care about etiquette. She cared about dominance. I felt Ethan stiffen beside me. This was his cue. This was the moment he should have said, "Mom, that is private," or, "We are not discussing finances tonight." Instead, he took a long sip of his wine. "I am comfortable," I said, aiming for a polite deflection. "Comfortable is a relative term," Lorraine countered instantly. She set her fork down and clasped her hands. "Comfortable for a college student is ramen noodles. Comfortable for a Caldwell is different. What is the number? Dear Ethan tells me you are helping him save. I need to know if you are pulling your weight." The implication was clear. I was a leech. I was the financial deadweight dragging her golden boy down. "I make $112,000 a year," I said. I did not want to say it. It felt crass, but her gaze was a physical weight, pressing the answer out of me. plus an annual bonus structure of 15%. Lorraine raised an eyebrow. It was not a look of being impressed. It was a look of pity. 112, she murmured. That is nice, for a single woman starting out. But in this economy, with inflation at 3.2%, can you even afford a mortgage in a decent school district with that? I am not looking for a house right now, I said. I have a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment that suits me perfectly. A lease, she said, the word dripping with disdain. So you are throwing equity away. You are paying someone else's mortgage. She turned to Ethan. You remember Vanessa? The architect? She bought her first property at 28, a brownstone in Denver. Beautiful girl. Came from a good family. She understood the value of assets. The ghost of the ideal daughter-in-law had entered the chat. Vanessa, the architect, the homeowner, the woman I was failing to be. Mom, Vanessa moved to Chicago, Ethan mumbled, staring at his plate. But she had ambition. Ethan, Lorraine snapped. She had a 5-year plan that didn't involve renting an apartment in Lake Arbor until she was 40. She drove a Lexus, not a what is it you drive. Autumn, a Honda. It is a reliable car, I said, my cheeks heating up despite my best efforts. It is paid off. It is utilitarian, Lorraine corrected. It says, I am content with getting by. It does not say, I am going places. Sophia, who had been pushing her food around her plate in silence, suddenly looked up. I think it is smart to avoid car payments, she ventured timidly. We are still paying off the SUV, and the interest is… Grant, Lorraine said sharply, not even looking at Sophia. Your wife is speaking about finances again. I thought we discussed this. Grant's hand shot out and clamped onto Sophia's wrist. It wasn't violent, but it was firm, a restraint. Not now. Sophie, he muttered. Sophia closed her mouth. She shrank back into her chair, her eyes glossy. I looked at Grant, seeing the resignation on his face. He was not protecting his wife. He was managing her to appease his mother. He was part of the machinery. I looked at Ethan. He was my last line of defense. He knew how hard I worked. He knew I maxed out my retirement accounts. He knew I had 0 consumer debt. He knew I was proud of my life. Ethan, I said softly. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the conflict. He knew this was wrong. He knew she was dissecting me for sport, but then he looked at his mother at the steely set of her jaw. The expectancy in her eyes, and the fear won out. He looked away. He picked up his wineglass again. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose to let the storm batter me so he could stay dry. Lorraine saw the exchange. She saw his weakness and my isolation, and she moved in for the kill. She picked up her wineglass, swirled it, and looked me dead in the eye. You see, Autumn, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone at the table could hear. We all want to believe we are doing well, but there is a difference between survival and success. You seem like a nice girl, hardworking, but let us be honest, a leased apartment, a 10-year-old car, a job in logistics, it is stable, it is safe. She took a sip, letting the silence stretch until it was thin enough to snap. But stability is just a pretty word people use to describe mediocrity so they can sleep at night, and my son was not raised to settle for mediocrity. The insult landed in the center of my chest. It was not just a critique of my finances, it was a negation of my entire existence. She was telling me that everything I had built, my independence, my career, my home, was trash. And she was telling me that in her eyes, I would never be anything more than an anchor dragging her son to the bottom. The room was silent. The only sound was the clinking of Lorraine's fork as she calmly returned to her Brussels sprouts, satisfied that she had successfully diagnosed the disease. I sat there, frozen, waiting for Ethan to say something, anything, but the silence from the chair next to me was the loudest thing in the room. The word hung in the air, heavier than the chandelier above our heads. Mediocrity. That was where she had started. But Lorraine Caldwell was not a woman who stopped at half measures. She saw that I was still sitting upright, that I had not yet crumbled into a heap of tears, and she decided to escalate from an insult to a verdict. "Let us be precise," she said, wiping the corner of her mouth with her linen napkin. "It is not just about money. Autumn, it is about trajectory. Ethan is destined for the C-suite. He needs a partner who understands that world. Someone who can host galas, not someone who worries about operation logistics. By clinging to this small life, you are not just holding yourself back, you are dragging him down. You are a failure of potential." There it was, failure. She said it casually, as if she were commenting on the dryness of the turkey. She called me a failure in front of her son, her other son, and her daughter-in-law. She defined my entire 34 years of struggle and survival as a net negative. Something inside me snapped. It was not a loud snap. It was the quiet, metallic click of a lock disengaging. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the tablecloth, his face a mask of conflict avoidance. He was letting her say this. He was letting her rewrite my identity because he was too afraid to tell her to shut up. I placed my hands flat on the table. "I am not a failure," I said. My voice was low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "I have zero debt. I have a 6-figure career that I built from nothing. I pay my own bills. I do not ask anyone for permission to exist. I am proud of the life I have built." Lorraine laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. "Pride in survival is for people who have no ambition for anything else." "I am not surviving," I countered, looking her dead in the eye. "I am living, and I am doing it with dignity, which is more than I can say for this conversation." I took a breath, letting the anger fuel my spine. "This is a Thanksgiving dinner. Lorraine, it is not a courtroom, and you are not the judge of my value." The silence that followed was absolute. Grant stopped chewing. Sophia looked like she wanted to slide under the table. I had done the unthinkable. I had spoken back. I had drawn a boundary. Lorraine's eyes widened, not in hurt, but in theatrical shock. She turned her head slowly toward Ethan, like a turret gun swiveling to its next target. "Ethan," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "are you going to allow this? Are you going to sit there and let this woman disrespect your mother in your brother's home?" This was the test. This was the moment. I looked at him. I needed him to say one thing. I needed him to say, "She is right. Mom, stop." Ethan looked up. His face was red. His eyes panicked. He looked from his mother, who looked like an empress demanding an execution, to me, the woman he had claimed to love for 2.5 years. He did the calculus. He weighed the discomfort of fighting his mother against the ease of sacrificing me. He chose ease. "Autumn, stop," he snapped. "I will not stop," I said, my voice rising just a fraction. "She just called me a failure." I said stop. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "God, why do you have to be so difficult? Just apologize to her." "Apologize," I whispered. "For what?" "For starting a fight," he yelled. "Do not argue with my mother. Autumn, I told you, do not argue with her." He took a jagged breath, and then he delivered the 6 words that ended us. "Don't argue with her, or get out." The sentence hung there, vibrating in the silence. Get out. He had not just failed to defend me. He had evicted me. He had looked at the woman attacking me and handed her a weapon. I looked at him one last time. I wanted to memorize his face, the weakness, the sweat on his brow, the pathetic attempt to look authoritative while cowering before his mommy. I did not feel sad. I felt a sudden, icy clarity. "Okay," I said. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not ask him how he could do this. I simply nodded. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh and final. I picked up my purse from the floor. I walked past Grant, who was staring at his plate in shame. I walked past Sophia, who had tears in her eyes but said nothing. I walked past Lorraine, who was smiling into her wine glass. I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and out the front door. The cold air hit me like a slap, waking me up from a 2-year coma. I got into my car. My hands were steady as I started the engine. I backed out of the driveway, leaving the warm glow of the house behind. I was halfway down the block when my phone, which was connected to the car's Bluetooth, started to ring. It was Ethan. I let it ring. Then, a notification popped up on the dashboard screen. It wasn't a text to me. It was a notification from an iPad, Ethan's iPad, which he had left in my back seat earlier that week when he borrowed my car to move some boxes. It was synced to his iMessage account. The message was from a group chat named Caldwell Core. The sender was Lorraine. The timestamp was 2 hours ago, before we had even arrived. Phase 1 starts at appetizers. I will hit her on the career. Ethan, you stay quiet until I give the signal. If she cracks, we know she is not resilient enough for the family. Do not disappoint me. I stared at the glowing screen. It wasn't just a bad dinner. It wasn't just a difficult mother. It was a script. They had rehearsed my humiliation. Ethan hadn't just failed to defend me. He had been following stage directions. I drove toward the highway, the red taillights of the cars ahead of me blurring into streaks. They wanted to test my resilience. They wanted to see if I was strong enough. I reached over and turned off the notification. They had their answer. I was not just strong enough to leave. I was smart enough to make sure that when I struck back, I wouldn't need a script. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped into the darkness. The silence that greeted me was usually a comfort, a soft landing after a long day at Cinderline Systems. Tonight, it felt different. It felt temporary. I did not throw my keys. I did not collapse onto the floor in a puddle of tears. I walked straight to the kitchen island, opened my laptop, and logged into my bank account. Ethan had told me to get out. He had issued a command, in his mind. That meant I would leave his brother's house, go home, and wait for him to return so he could gaslight me into an apology. He thought, get out was a pause button. I interpreted it as an eviction notice for our entire life together. But before I executed the exit strategy, I needed to understand the enemy. My mind kept replaying the notification on the dashboard. Phase 1 starts at appetizers. It implied a Phase 2, a plan, a strategy. I walked over to the vintage oak desk in the corner of the living room. It was my desk, bought with my bonus 2 years ago. But Ethan had slowly colonized it with his gaming peripherals and stacks of paper. I opened the bottom drawer. I knew he was messy. I knew he never filed anything. I began to sift through the chaos of receipts and mail. It took me less than 5 minutes to find it. It was a thick envelope, unsealed, with the logo of a private lending firm on the front. I pulled out the document. It was a draft for a secured investment loan. The amount was $350,000. The purpose was listed as capital investment for residential property acquisition. I scanned the names. Primary borrower, Ethan Caldwell. Co-borrower, Autumn Salas. Guarantor, Lorraine Caldwell. My breath hitched. I flipped to the terms. The loan was structured to purchase a rundown property in Briar Glen, likely a fixer-upper project for Ethan to play real estate mogul with. But the kicker was in the fine print on page 12. The deed to the property would be held in a trust managed by the guarantor, Lorraine. The picture snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. The dinner, the insults, the attack on my career. It was not just cruelty, it was a demolition job. They needed to break my confidence. They needed me to feel like a failure, like I was lucky that a Caldwell would even look at me, if I felt small enough, if I felt like I needed to prove my worth to the family. I would sign this. I would leverage my 805 credit score and my steady income to secure a loan for a house I would pay for but never legally own. Phase 1 was humiliation. Phase 2 was financial extraction. I placed the document on the desk and took a photo of it with my phone. Then I uploaded the photo to a secure cloud drive. I was done feeling hurt. I was now operating in damage control mode. I sat down at the kitchen island and opened a new browser window. It was 8:30 at night on Thanksgiving. Most businesses were closed, but money does not sleep, and neither does the gig economy. First, I emailed my landlord. My lease had a 60-day termination clause. But it also had a break lease option if I paid a penalty equal to 2 months of rent. I transferred $4,200 to the management company's portal immediately. I typed out a formal notice I am vacating the premises effective immediately. The penalty has been paid. The keys will be left on the counter. I was burning $4,000 to buy my freedom. It was the best investment I had ever made. Next, I opened a tab for a local moving app that specialized in emergency and after-hours jobs. I found a crew rated 4.8 stars who advertised 24/7 rapid response. I booked them for 10 o'clock that night. I paid the double-time holiday surcharge without blinking. Then, I rented a 10 by 10 climate-controlled storage unit online at a facility 3 miles away. I received the gate code via text message 2 minutes later. With the logistics secured, I began the physical separation of assets. I did not act like a scorned lover. I acted like a crime scene cleaner. I moved methodically from room to room. I packed only what I had receipts for, only what was indisputably mine. My clothes, my books, the artwork, the expensive coffee maker. When I got to the living room, I faced the sectional sofa. It was mine. The TV was mine. The rug was mine. I started dismantling the room. I left Ethan's things exactly where they were. His gaming monitor sat on the bare floor where the desk had been. His pile of dirty laundry remained in the corner of the bedroom. His toothbrush sat in a solitary cup on the bathroom sink. I did not break anything. I did not pour bleach on his clothes. I did not cut cords. I wanted to leave zero room for him to claim I was hysterical or destructive. I was simply removing my property from a location where it was no longer welcome. At 10:15, the movers arrived. They were 2 large, silent men who did not ask why a woman was moving out of her apartment on Thanksgiving night. They simply lifted the furniture and marched it down to the truck. For 2 hours, the apartment underwent a reverse metamorphosis. It went from a warm, lived-in home to a cold, echoing box. The sound of packing tape ripping off the roll was the only noise in the space. By midnight, the apartment was a skeleton. I stood in the center of the living room. All that remained were Ethan's possessions, looking pathetic and small without the context of my life surrounding them. His gaming chair sat in the middle of the empty carpet. His boxes of books were stacked against a wall that was now bare of my photos. I took out my phone and recorded a slow, panning video of the entire apartment. I zoomed in on his intact computer, his untouched clothes, his undamaged collectibles. I narrated the date and time in a calm voice. November 28th, 12:05 a.m. All items belonging to Autumn Salas have been removed. All items belonging to Ethan Caldwell remain in their original condition. I ended the recording and uploaded it to the cloud. I walked to the kitchen counter and placed my set of keys next to the lease termination confirmation I had printed out. I took one last look around. It did not look like a tragedy. It looked like a stage after the play has been canceled and the set has been struck. Ethan had told me to get out. He wanted me to leave the room. Instead, I had removed the entire world he was standing on. I turned off the lights, plunging his abandoned possessions into darkness, and walked out the door for the final time. I checked into a generic chain hotel on the outskirts of Lake Arbor at 1 in the morning. I did not go to a friend's house. I did not go to my parents' place 3 hours away. I knew that if I went anywhere familiar, Ethan would find me. I needed to be a ghost. I placed my phone on the cheap laminate nightstand, plugged it in, and watched the screen light up. It was not a communication device anymore. It was a bomb that refused to stop detonating. Ethan realized I was gone at 12:45 in the morning. That was when the first call came in. By 3 in the morning, I had 42 missed calls and 63 text messages. The progression of his messages was a fascinating case study in the psychology of a narcissist losing control. The first dozen were confusion. "Babe, where are you? The apartment looks weird. Did you take the rug?" Then came the anger. "Pick up the phone. This is childish. You can't just strip the apartment and disappear because you got your feelings hurt. Pick up." By 2 in the morning, when the reality set in that I was not coming back to apologize, the tone shifted to panic. "Please, Autumn, I am sorry about dinner. Mom is just stressed. We can fix this. I love you. Don't do this to us. And finally, when the sun began to bleed through the heavy blackout curtains of my hotel room, the threats arrived. You are ruining my life. You are humiliating me. If you do not answer me by noon, I am coming to your office. You are acting like a psycho. I did not sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, drinking terrible hotel coffee, watching the notifications scroll by like a ticker tape of a stock market crash. I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was the same feeling I got when a supply chain collapsed at work. I did not panic. I organized. I opened my laptop and created a new folder titled Harassment Documentation. I took screenshots of every text. I transcribed the voicemails. I logged the timestamps. I was not building a scrapbook. I was building a restraining order if it came to that. At 8 in the morning on Black Friday, the matriarch entered the chat. An email landed in my inbox from lcaldwell@academicmail.net. The subject line was simply, "A path forward." I opened it. The text was formatted with impeccable grammar, justified margins, and the condescending tone of a dean placing a student on academic probation. Dear Autumn, Ethan tells me there was an unfortunate scene at the apartment last night. While I found your behavior at dinner to be lacking in resilience, I am willing to attribute your flight response to immaturity rather than malice. Families have disagreements. High-functioning families resolve them. If you return the furniture and offer a sincere apology to the family for walking out on Thanksgiving, I am willing to overlook this episode. We can start over. However, if you persist in this histrionic behavior, you will prove my assessment of your character to be correct. Dr. Caldwell. I read it twice. It was masterful manipulation. She was offering me a chance to come back and be abused further, framed as a benevolent gift. She wanted me to apologize for being insulted. She wanted me to return the furniture so her son would not have to sit on the floor. And beneath it all, I sensed a tremor of fear. She needed me to sign that loan. She needed my credit score. Without me, their plan to buy the investment property crumbled. I moved the email to the evidence folder. By noon, the flying monkeys had been deployed. Grant sent a text that was clearly dictated by his mother but typed by his own thumbs. Hey Autumn, look, things got heated. Mom is really upset. Just come to brunch on Sunday and smooth things over. Don't overreact. Then came the messages from our mutual friends. A notification popped up from a group chat I had been part of for 2 years. So we heard you stormed out of Thanksgiving. Ethan is a wreck. He says you freaked out because his mom asked about your job. That seems a little sensitive, doesn't it? Ethan was controlling the narrative. He was spinning a story where I was the unstable, fragile girlfriend who couldn't handle a little traditional family questioning and had Manic cleaned the apartment in a fit of rage. He was painting me as the villain to inoculate himself against the truth. I did not reply to the group chat. I simply left the group. I selected Ethan's contact info. I had one message to send. It had to be absolute. It had to be a wall, not a door. I typed, "You told me to get out." I did. Now respect that decision. Do not contact me again, or I will involve legal counsel. I hit send. Then I blocked his number. I blocked Grant. I blocked Lorraine's email address. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was mine. I sat there in the hotel room, the adrenaline slowly fading into a cold, hard focus. I thought about Lorraine's email. I thought about the way she wielded her title like a cudgel. Dr. Caldwell. She used it to silence people. She used it to establish instant superiority. She had mocked my career in operations, claiming it was small compared to her academic heights. I pulled up a search engine. I have hired people for high-level positions at Cinderline. I know how to background check a candidate. If someone claims to be a doctor of comparative literature, there is a paper trail. There are dissertations. There are published articles. There are university directories. I typed Lorraine Caldwell, PhD, into the search bar. The results were sparse. A few mentions in local community newsletters. A listing for a book club she organized in Briar Glen. A donor list for a local charity. I narrowed the search. I tried Lorraine Caldwell dissertation. Nothing. I tried her maiden name, which I remembered seeing on an old wedding invite Ethan had kept Lorraine Miller. I searched Lorraine Miller Caldwell thesis. I went to the ProQuest dissertation database, which indexes nearly every doctoral thesis published in North America in the last 80 years. I paid the $30 access fee. I ran every variation of her name. 0 results. I sat back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. A woman who corrects people's grammar at dinner, who demands to be addressed as doctor before she even takes off her coat, who bases her entire personality on intellectual superiority, does not just forget to have her dissertation indexed. I dug deeper. I found her LinkedIn profile. It listed PhD, comparative literature, but did not list the university. It just said, private university. That was a massive red flag. Academics love to list their alma mater. It is their currency. I found a bio for her on the website of a local nonprofit board she sat on. It said, Dr. Caldwell holds a doctorate in humanities and has consulted for various educational bodies. Doctorate in humanities is vague. It is the kind of thing you buy from a diploma mill online for $299. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound in the empty hotel room. Lorraine Caldwell was a fraud. She was not a scholar. She was an insecure woman wrapping herself in a stolen title to intimidate people she felt threatened by. She had called me a failure. She had called me mediocre. All while she was parading around a fake degree to prop up her fragile ego. The fear vanished. The feeling of being hunted evaporated. I was no longer the prey. I was the one holding the magnifying glass. They had tried to destroy my reputation with rumors and lies. I now held a truth that could dismantle their entire social standing in Briar Glen. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. The sun was setting over Lake Arbord. I had a plan. I was going to rest. I was going to find a new apartment. And then, I was going to introduce the real Dr. Caldwell to the world. The following morning, I sat in a coffee shop 3 towns over, treating the dismantling of Lorraine Caldwell's reputation like a forensic accounting project. I had already established that her doctorate was non-existent in the academic record. That was embarrassing, but it was not necessarily illegal. Vanity is a sin, but fraud is a crime. I needed to know if she had crossed that line. I spent 4 hours combing through the public meeting minutes and vendor contracts of the local organizations Lorraine was involved with. It did not take long. I found a PDF hosted on the server of the Briar Glen Community Foundation. It was a consulting agreement from 2 years ago for an educational outreach strategy. The fee was $5,000. The signature at the bottom was flamboyant and looped. Reading Dr. Lorraine Caldwell, PhD, I downloaded the document. I also downloaded the Foundation's bylaws, which explicitly stated that consultants must possess the credentials they claim in their proposals. By signing that contract as a doctor to inflate her consulting fee or authority, she had not just lied to her dinner guests, she had defrauded a non-profit organization. While I was compiling this dossier, my phone continued to vibrate with the fallout from Ethan's smear campaign. A mutual friend sent me a screenshot of a post Ethan had made on his private social media. Restricted to close friends but porous enough to leak. He claimed I was having a mental health crisis and that I had abandoned him after a minor family disagreement. He was playing the victim perfectly, setting the stage to explain why he couldn't buy that investment property anymore, blaming it on my instability rather than his inability to secure financing without my credit score. I realized that silence was no longer a strategy, it was a liability. I needed to clear the record, not for him, but for myself. I drafted an email. I did not write it in anger. I wrote it with the cool detachment of a lawyer filing a motion. I addressed it to the Caldwell family and friends, a distribution list I had been added to months ago for reunion planning. It included Grant, Sophia, Ethan, Lorraine, and about 15 aunts, uncles, and cousins who had likely heard the rumors. The subject line was simple, regarding Thanksgiving and my departure. I wrote, "Dear all, I have been made aware of the narrative circulating regarding my sudden departure from dinner on Thursday. To prevent further concern about my mental health, I would like to clarify the events. I did not leave because I was emotional. I did not leave because of a disagreement. I left because Ethan explicitly told me, in front of the table, to get out, if I would not accept being called a failure by his mother. I respected his request and removed myself from his home and his life. Attached are the timestamps of the messages confirming this ultimatum, as well as a draft of a loan agreement Ethan attempted to have me co-sign without my full consent, which clarifies the financial pressure I was under. I attached the screenshot of the text where he said, "You are ruining my life," and the photo of the loan document listing Lorraine as the guarantor. I hit send. The reaction was not immediate, but when it came, it was seismic. The first crack in the Caldwell facade came from an unexpected place. Sophia called me. I debated not answering, but I picked up. Her voice was shaking. She did not call to yell. She called to whisper. "You really did it," she said. "You actually left." "I had to, Sophia," I said. "She called me a breeder when I was pregnant with our second," Sophia confessed, her voice cracking. "She told Grant I was losing my intellectual edge. I sat there and took it because Grant told me to keep the peace. I thought I had to. Seeing you walk out, it made me realize I have been a coward for 6 years." Sophia told me she had seen the email. She told me she had shown it to Grant. She told me that for the first time in their marriage, Grant did not make an excuse for his mother. He had looked at the loan document, looked at the insults, and simply gone into his study and closed the door. He was not defending me, but he was no longer acting as Lorraine's human shield. The narrative in Briar Glen began to pivot. The screenshot of the loan document was the catalyst. It is one thing to be a controlling mother. It is another to be a mother trying to leverage a girlfriend's credit score to build a family real estate portfolio. People began to ask questions. Why was Lorraine so involved in her 34-year-old son's finances? Why did she need a cosigner? Was the Caldwell money as endless as she pretended? Or was the house of cards held together by debt and delusion? I let those questions simmer for 24 hours. Then, I played my final card. I did not post the evidence of her fake degree on social media. That would have looked like petty revenge. Instead, I sent a private, formal letter to the board of directors of the Briar Glen Community Foundation. I wrote, "I am writing to bring a potential credentialing discrepancy to your attention regarding a past consultant, Lorraine Caldwell. Public records indicate she was compensated as a PhD-level expert. However, a search of all major academic databases yields no record of this doctoral degree. As a concerned citizen and advocate for transparency in nonprofit spending, I suggest you verify her credentials for your own compliance records. I did not accuse, I merely inquired. I let the bureaucracy do the work for me." 3 days later, the aftershocks reached me. Sophia texted me again. She said the atmosphere at the Caldwell house was apocalyptic. A registered letter had arrived for Lorraine from the foundation, requesting clarification and documentation of her academic credentials for an internal audit. Lorraine had built a fortress out of snobbery and elitism. She had used her title to make other people feel small. She had tried to crush me because I was an operations manager who dealt in logistics. She failed to realize that logistics is the art of details, and she had left a very large, very fraudulent detail unattended. I sat in my new, temporary apartment, watching the sun go down. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a single plate. I had simply told the truth to the right people at the right time. And across town, the great Dr. Caldwell was learning that you cannot pay for a reputation with currency you counterfeited. The ground was shifting under her feet, and this time, there was no one left to catch her. The summons came 3 days after the letter from the foundation arrived at Lorraine's doorstep. It was an invitation from Grant, framed as a peace offering. He asked me to meet them at a neutral location, a private room at a bistro in downtown Lake Arbor, to clear the air and find a path forward. He emphasized that several aunts and uncles would be there, implying that this was a safe space mediated by the extended family. I knew exactly what it was. It was an ambush. It was a classic pressure tactic designed to use social shaming to force me back into line. Ethan believed that if I were surrounded by his family, I would be too polite to stand my ground. He thought the weight of the Caldwell name would crush my resolve. I accepted the invitation. I did not go to reconcile. I went to close the file. I walked into the private dining room at 7 o'clock. The atmosphere was stifling. Ethan was standing by the fireplace, looking mournful and rehearsed. Lorraine was seated in a high-backed velvet chair, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Around them sat Grant, Sophia, and three of Ethan's aunts who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "Autumn," Ethan said, stepping forward with his arms open, as if he expected me to run into them. "I am so glad you came. We just want to fix this." I did not hug him. I pulled out a chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. "Grant said you wanted to talk. I am listening." Lorraine sighed, a long, tragic sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. She lowered her handkerchief and looked at me with the eyes of a martyr. "We are just confused. Autumn," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "We welcomed you into our home. We treated you like family. And then, over one small comment about career ambition, you exploded. You abandoned Ethan. You tried to humiliate me with these administrative audits. You are destroying this family because you cannot handle constructive criticism." The aunts nodded in unison. The narrative had been set. I was the fragile, vindictive woman who had overreacted. I placed my hands on the table. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the clarity of a judge delivering a verdict. "Let us be clear about three things," I said. "First, you did not offer constructive criticism. You called me a failure and a mediocre person in front of a dinner table of strangers. You attacked my livelihood to assert dominance." Lorraine opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a finger. "Second," I continued, turning my gaze to Ethan, "I did not abandon you. You gave me an ultimatum. You said, and I quote, 'Don't argue with her, or get out.' You drew a line in the sand. You chose her. I simply respected your choice and left the room." "It was the heat of the moment," Ethan protested, his face flushing. "I didn't mean it like that. You are twisting my words." "And third," I said, ignoring his outburst and reaching into my bag, "I did not leave because my feelings were hurt. I left because I realized I was being recruited for a financial transaction, not a marriage." I pulled out the file folder I had brought with me. I slid a copy of the loan draft across the polished mahogany table. It spun slowly and came to a stop in front of Grant. "Ethan," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a laser, "did you or did you not intend to ask me to co-sign a loan for $350,000 for a property that would be held in a trust managed by your mother?" The room went deadly silent. The aunts leaned in. Grant looked down at the paper, his face draining of color. "That was just a draft," Ethan stammered. He looked at his mother for help, but Lorraine was staring at me with pure venom. "We hadn't even discussed it yet. It was just an idea for our future." "It was dated 2 days before Thanksgiving," I said. "And here's the email thread between you and the broker." I slid a second sheet of paper across the table. "In this email, you state, and I quote, 'She will sign. She is eager to please my mother. We can get the rate locked by December 1st. I looked around the room. "Eager to please. That is what I was to you. A credit score wrapped in a girlfriend." Grant stood up. The chair legs screeched against the floor. He picked up the document and read the clause about the trust. He looked at the email. Then he looked at his mother. "You told me Ethan could afford the investment on his own," Grant said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a dangerous weight. "You told me you just needed his signature for the family trust. You didn't tell me you were leveraging Autumn's credit because the bank turned you down." "It is financial strategy." "Grant," Lorraine snapped, dropping the Victim Act instantly. Her voice became sharp and commanding. "We need to secure assets. If she marries into this family, her assets are our assets. That is how wealth is built. She should be honored to contribute to the legacy." "Honored?" Sophia spoke up. It was the first time I had heard her voice sound strong in 2 years. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "She should be honored to be used. Is that what you think of us? Assets to be managed?" "Be quiet, Sophia," Lorraine hissed. "This does not concern you. It concerns all of us. Sophia said, standing up to join her husband. You have bullied me for 6 years. You have criticized my parenting, my weight, and my intelligence, and now I see you trying to trap this woman into a debt she cannot control. I am done. Lorraine, I will not let my children grow up thinking this is what love looks like. Sit down. Lorraine slammed her hand on the table. I am Dr. Caldwell, and I will not be spoken to like this by, you are not a doctor, I said. The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out. I checked the registries. Lorraine, I said softly. I checked the dissertations. There is no record. You have been using a title you did not earn to intimidate people who actually work for a living, and now the Foundation knows it too. Lorraine's face turned a color I had never seen on a human being, a mix of purple and gray. She looked at the ants. They were looking at her with horror. She looked at Ethan. He was staring at the table, defeated. She looked at Grant, and she saw a son who had finally seen the wizard behind the curtain. She opened her mouth to scream, to rage, to throw insults, but nothing came out. Her power had always come from the illusion of superiority. I had stripped it away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but a sad, fraudulent woman in a velvet chair. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my coat. Ethan, I said. He looked up. His eyes were red. He looked like a child who had broken a toy he couldn't fix. I am sorry, he whispered. I can fix this. We can go to counseling. I will stand up to her. Just give me a chance. I looked at him, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the relief of a person who has walked away from a burning building before the roof collapsed. I did not leave because of a single insult, I said, delivering the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I left because the person I intended to marry chose to stand with the person insulting me. You made your choice at that dinner table. Now you have to live with it. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the private room, past the stunned hostess, and out into the cool night air. I did not block their numbers again. I didn't need to. They knew, and I knew, that Autumn Salas was gone. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away. I had a new apartment to furnish. I had a career to manage. I had a life that belonged entirely to me. And as I merged onto the highway, watching the city lights of Lake Arbor twinkle in the distance, I knew that the best revenge wasn't the exposure or the humiliation I had dealt them. The best revenge was the happiness I was about to find without them. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country, and let's share our thoughts on how to handle toxic in-laws. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to Zoe Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people who might need the courage to walk away.